The old dog smelled the storm before anyone else did. Clyde had been watching him all morning. The way Kodiak kept pressing his nose to the gap beneath the back door, the way he paced from one end of the porch to the other without settling, the way he'd look up at Clyde with those amber eyes like he was trying to say something that words couldn't carry. Clyde Rourke had spent 31 years in the army learning to read the land. And the one thing those years had taught him was this: when a dog goes quiet and watches, you watch too. His neighbors hadn't learned that lesson. They drove past his property most mornings on the way to work, slowing just enough to shake their heads at what he'd been building for the past 4 months. Something about the sight of an old man, 68 years old, white at the temples, bad knee from Mosul, crawling under his own house with a level and a chalk line seemed to strike them as pitiable. Or funny, mostly funny from the sound of it. Before we get into what happened, I want to ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. I always like to know. It had started in September when the first hint of cold came down through the Ozarks and settled over the hollow like something that meant business. Clyde had stood on his back porch with a cup of coffee and looked at the tree line and done the math the way old soldiers do, not with hope, but with facts. The winter of 2022 had knocked the power out for 11 days in this part of southern Missouri. The winter of 2023 had been worse. He didn't need a weather service to tell him what was coming. He needed lumber. He'd drawn the plans himself on graph paper at the kitchen table, Kodiak lying across his boots the whole time. Kodiak was a 5-year-old Bernese mountain dog, black and white and rust-colored, built like a small bear, with a personality that sat somewhere between devoted and ridiculous. He'd come to Clyde 3 years ago, through a veterans rescue organization. And from the first night he'd slept at the foot of Clyde's bed, neither of them had been particularly interested in being apart. The plans were for a firewood storage system, but not the kind you'd find at a hardware store. Clyde had designed something that wrapped around 3 sides of the house. A covered lean-to structure with ventilated walls to season wood faster, an elevated floor to keep moisture out, and a snow deflection angle on the roof calculated to dump accumulation away from the crawl space vents. He'd sketched the load-bearing supports based on the estimated weight of 8 full cords of wood. He'd done the math on the airflow. He'd thought about every part of it the same way he'd thought about supply lines in the field. What do you need? How much of it? And what happens when resupply doesn't come? His neighbor across the road, a man named Prentice, had pulled into Clyde's driveway one Saturday in October to watch him work. Prentice was younger by maybe 15 years, the kind of man who kept his lawn edged and his opinions sharp. What exactly is that supposed to be? Prentice had asked, leaning against his truck with his arms crossed. Wood storage, Clyde said without looking up from his measurements. Prentice squinted at the framing going up along the north wall of the house. You're building it around the house? That's the general idea. There was a pause. Clyde heard Prentice shift his weight on the gravel. You know they make those little metal racks at Tractor Supply, Prentice said. Hold about a cord. $30. I know. That's probably enough for most people. Clyde set down his tape measure and looked at the man. I'm not most people, he said, and went back to work. By the time Prentice pulled out of the driveway, Clyde could hear him laughing on his phone. He didn't need to hear the words to know the story was already making its way around town. The old vet on Hollis Road was building some kind of wooden fortress around his house. His dog watched from the porch. They both thought it was funny. Kodiak watched Prentice drive away and then turned back to Clyde and sneezed once, which was as close to an editorial as a Bernese mountain dog ever got. Clyde's daughter called that evening. Her name was Meredith, and she lived in St. Louis with her husband and 2 kids, and she loved her father in the way that people love someone they worry about from a safe distance. Dad, she said. Mr. Prentice texted his daughter, and she texted me. Small towns, Clyde said. He says you're building a shed around the house. I am. Like, around the whole house? 3 sides. I didn't want to block the front porch view. There was a long pause on the line. He could hear one of his grandchildren in the background, running across hardwood floors. Dad, are you okay? Like, actually okay? He looked at Kodiak, who was lying in the kitchen doorway with his chin on his paws, watching Clyde the way he always did. I'm better than okay, Clyde said. I'm prepared. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I just worry. I know you do, he said. But you don't have to. He didn't tell her about the nightmares. There was no point. They were the same ones he'd been having for 20 years, the kind where you're back in country, and the radio's gone quiet, and you don't know where the sound went, just that the silence is the bad part. Kodiak had figured that out within the first month. When the dreams got bad enough to pull Clyde halfway out of sleep, the dog would shift his weight at the foot of the bed, press himself against Clyde's legs, and stay there, warm and steady, until the room came back into focus. There were nights Clyde woke up with his hand already buried in the dog's coat, and he didn't remember reaching for him. He'd told the VA counselor about it once. She'd said it sounded like a healthy coping mechanism. Clyde had said, "He's not a mechanism, he's Kodiak." She'd smiled and written something down. The building went on through October and into November. Clyde worked in the mornings when his knee was loose and the light was good, and he took his time, the way you could only take time when you'd learned that rushing things was how people got hurt. He'd retired from a 31-year career with his back and his mind mostly intact, and he credited that to patience more than anything else. The patience to plan, the patience to wait, the patience to understand that a situation wasn't yours to control, only to prepare for. Kodiak supervised from a moving position, sometimes the porch, sometimes the gravel drive. Sometimes he sat directly next to whatever Clyde was working on and stared at it with the gravity of a foreman who wasn't entirely sure the contractor knew what he was doing. By mid-November, the structure was up. The ventilated walls ran along the north and east sides of the house, connected at the back corner where the prevailing wind came from. The lean-to roof was angled at 22 degrees, which Clyde had calculated would shed the heaviest wet snow without the overhang collapsing. He'd seen that happen to a carport down the road during the last ice storm. The elevated floor sat on treated 6x6 posts, sunk 18 inches into the ground. He'd left a 3-foot walking path between the woodpile and the house wall, so he could reach the stacked cords without moving more than a few steps in bad weather. Then he'd started filling it. He bought 8 cords from 3 different people, 2 from a man up the hollow, who cut hardwood himself, 3 from a timber operation east of town, and 3 more he cut himself over the course of October, a little at a time when the knee allowed. He stacked it in sections, the driest wood close to the door, the green wood toward the back to finish seasoning, the kindling split fine and stored in a wire bin he'd hung from the rafters where it would stay dry. His son-in-law, Marcus, had driven down from St. Louis on a Sunday to see it. Marcus was a good man. Clyde had always thought so. Smart, careful, good to Meredith, patient with the kids. He walked around the structure twice without saying anything. Then he stood back and looked at it from the road. "It's actually really well built," Marcus said. "Thank you. The neighbors think you've lost it, I know." Marcus turned to look at him. "Have you?" Clyde looked at Kodiak, who was sitting beside him with his shoulder pressed against Clyde's leg. "Not yet," he said. Marcus laughed. It wasn't the kind of laugh Prentice had used. It was a different kind. The kind that comes with respect, even if the person isn't quite sure yet why they're feeling it. The storm came on the 3rd of December. The National Weather Service had been tracking it since Thanksgiving. A system moving up from Texas that had been pulling moisture off the Gulf for 2 weeks and was going to drop somewhere between 14 and 22 inches on the southern Missouri Ozarks. The forecast had updated 4 times in the 5 days before it hit, and each time the snowfall estimate went up, not down. By the time it arrived, the local emergency management office had issued a level 2 snow emergency for 3 counties. Schools closed 2 days early. The gas station on Route 60 sold out of everything but windshield washer fluid and sunflower seeds. Kodiak had known before any of it. The night before the storm hit, he didn't settle. He paced the house from the back door to the front window and back again, checking things the way a sentry checks a perimeter. Clyde let him go. He'd been through enough winters to know that restless animals were better weather instruments than anything the television told him, and he'd spent the previous 2 days doing what he'd been planning to do since September,
making sure the pipes were
wrapped. The generator was fueled and tested. The backup propane tank for the kitchen stove was full, and the firewood closest to the back door was dry and accessible. He'd stacked 2 weeks' worth of split hardwood inside the mudroom itself, a full cord just inside the door, so he wouldn't need to go outside during the worst of it. The first flakes fell at 4 in the morning. By 7, there was 8 inches on the ground, and it was still coming down hard. By noon, the road in front of the house had disappeared. Clyde made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with Kodiak's head in his lap and watched the snow pile against the base of the woodpile structure, watched it slide off the roof the way he'd calculated it would, watched the system he'd spent 4 months building do exactly what he'd designed it to do. He was on his second cup when Prentice knocked on the door. Clyde opened it. The man was standing on the porch in a ski jacket and work boots that were soaked through, snow on his shoulders, cheeks red from the cold. Behind him, across the road, the lights in his house were out. "Power's been out since 6, Prentice said. "Our heat's electric." Clyde looked at him for a moment. Kodiak sat beside him, watching Prentice with his ears forward. "Come in," Clyde said. "I'll put on more coffee." Prentice's wife came over 20 minutes later, and their 2 teenage boys, and then the family from the yellow house at the bend in the road. An older couple named the Fieldings, who'd moved out from Springfield 2 years ago and hadn't gotten around to installing a backup heat source, and then a woman named Joelle, who lived alone in the small white house past the creek and who had a wood stove but no dry wood, because the cord she'd ordered in October had been delivered green and never fully seasoned. Clyde's house held 8 people and 1 large, delighted dog. He built a fire in the living room hearth and kept it going through the afternoon. He made soup from what he had, potatoes and sausage and canned tomatoes, a recipe that wasn't complicated, but worked, and he let people sit wherever they needed to sit. The Fielding couple took the couch. The teenagers played cards at the kitchen table. Joelle sat in the reading chair near the fire with a cup of coffee, and something in her eyes that Clyde recognized as relief that had been close to something worse. Kodiak moved between all of them, checking in, pressing his head against whichever knee seemed most in need of it. He was a natural at this in a way that Clyde had never been, easy with strangers, easy with discomfort, carrying some quality that was difficult to name, but that changed the temperature of a room. The storm ran for 18 hours straight. The final accumulation was 21 inches. The power came back on the second day, at just past noon, and by then the snow on the main road had been cleared enough for the county plow to get through. Prentice stayed until the lights in his own house came back on. Before he left, he stood in Clyde's kitchen for a moment, looking out the back window at the woodpile structure, at the cord and a half that still remained, the clean elevated floor, the snow sitting harmlessly on the angled roof, and he didn't say anything for a long time. Then he turned to Clyde. "I owe you an apology," he said. "No, you don't," Clyde said. "I knew what I was building. I didn't need you to know too." Prentice looked like he wanted to argue with that, and then like he'd decided not to. He held out his hand. Clyde shook it. Kodiak walked Prentice to the door, not because anyone asked him to, just because that was the kind of dog he was. Meredith called that evening. "Mr. Prentice's daughter texted me again," she said. "I figured. She said her dad called you a genius." Clyde was quiet for a moment. Outside, the last of the light was turning the snow a pale blue. He didn't understand what he was looking at, Clyde said. "That's different from me being a genius. I just remembered what I learned." "What did you learn?" He looked at Kodiak, who was lying in the living room in front of the banked fire, already half asleep, paws twitching slightly the way they did when he dreamed about whatever dogs dream about. Running, probably. Something that moved fast across open ground. That the best time to build something is when it's calm, Clyde said. And that if you wait until you need it, you've already waited too long. Meredith was quiet on the other end then. Dad? Yeah, I'm sorry I asked if you'd lost it. You were worried, he said. That's different. She made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else. The kids want to come see you. And the dog. The dog will be thrilled, he said. I'll try to match his energy. She laughed for real this time. They talked for another 20 minutes. About the grandkids, about Christmas, about nothing important in the specific way that means everything. When you've been through something that reminded you how quickly warmth can run out. After he hung up, Clyde sat in the kitchen for a while without turning on a light, listening to the particular silence that only comes after a heavy snow, when the whole world has been muffled into something almost respectful. Kodiak came in from the living room and put his chin on Clyde's knee. Clyde put his hand on top of the dog's head and left it there. He thought about what he'd been building, really. Not the wood structure with its ventilated walls and calculated roof angles. Not the 8 cords of seasoned hardwood. Not the generator he'd tested twice a month since July. All of that was important. All of that mattered. But what he'd really been building, without quite knowing it, was evidence. Evidence that some things were worth doing slowly and quietly, without an audience, without approval, without anyone standing on the road nodding their head. Evidence that preparation wasn't pessimism. It was a kind of love, a way of saying to the people in your proximity, if something goes wrong, you'll be okay, because I already thought about it. He had learned that in the army, not in any training manual, but in the field, in the specific education that comes from depending on people who prepared and grieving the consequences when they didn't. He'd carried it home with him across 3 decades and 1 bad knee and a set of recurring dreams, and it had settled into him so deep that he sometimes forgot other people hadn't learned it the same way. Prentice hadn't. The Fieldings hadn't. Joelle hadn't. But they'd been warm. That was the part that mattered. In the weeks after the storm, things on Hollis Road changed in the small ways that places change after shared hardship. Nothing dramatic, nothing announced, just a different quality in the nods, exchanged at the end of driveways, a slightly longer pause before someone looked away. Prentice stopped his truck one Saturday in January to ask Clyde where he'd bought the posts for the elevated floor, and they stood in the cold for half an hour talking about wood moisture content and roof pitch, and the specific kind of maple that seasons fastest, and at some point, Clyde realized that Prentice was writing things down in a small notebook he'd pulled from his coat pocket. Joelle came by in February with a pan of cornbread, which she left on the porch without knocking. There was a note attached. For you and Kodiak, thank you for the fire and the soup and not making me feel stupid. J. Clyde read it twice, then put it on the refrigerator door. When spring came, and the snow pulled back from the ridge, and the hollow turned green again, Clyde started planning for next year. What he'd add to the structure, where he'd source the wood earlier, whether the east-facing wall needed a second ventilation strip to improve airflow in the damp spring months. He did this sitting on the back porch, in the early morning, Kodiak beside him. Both of them looking at the woodpile structure in the way that you look at something you built with your own hands and your own thinking. Something that held when it needed to hold. The neighbor kids started calling Kodiak by name when they passed on their bikes. One of the Prentice boys, the younger one, had taken to stopping at the fence to let the dog push his big head into his hands. And Clyde had watched this happen enough times to know the kid was going through something that he wasn't saying to anyone. He didn't interfere. Kodiak had it handled. Some things were like that. They didn't need explanation or management. They just needed presence. A warm body, a steady heartbeat, something that stayed. Clyde had never been particularly good at that himself. Not in the years when he'd been moving too fast and sleeping too light, and coming home from deployments into a house that felt like it belonged to someone else. He'd learned it slowly, in the quiet, partly from the land, partly from the work of his own hands, and partly, maybe mostly, from a black and white and rust-colored dog who had arrived in his life 3 years ago, like an answer to a question he hadn't quite gotten around to asking. The neighbors had stopped laughing somewhere around the time the power came back on, and their houses were warm again. But Clyde hadn't built any of it to stop them laughing. He'd built it the same way he'd done most things worth doing in his life, because the math made sense, because the situation required it, and because some promises you make not to people but to yourself, in the quiet before a storm. When the dog is pacing, and the wind is coming, and you already know what's on the way. He'd made that promise. He'd kept it. The rest had worked itself out.